They called her Mouse behind her back. Sarah Chun spoke so softly that students had to lean forward just to catch her words. At Riverside High, where teachers needed voices like megaphones to survive, she seemed completely out of place. The administration had already prepared her replacement paperwork. The notorious Class 3B had a reputation for breaking even the toughest educators, and this quiet woman with nervous hands and downcast eyes looked like she'd crumble before lunch. But sometimes the quietest storms are the most devastating. What happened in 30 seconds would transform not just a classroom, but the entire school. And it started with 3 simple words that no one saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Riverside High sat like a fortress of red brick and broken dreams. On the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. Inside its walls, stories traveled faster than gossip in a small town. Room 318 had earned its reputation as the graveyard of teaching careers. In 3 years, 11 different educators had tried to tame Class 3B. Some lasted months. Others barely made it through orientation week. The classroom itself seemed to harbor the ghosts of defeated teachers. Paint peeled from the walls in places where frustrated fists had connected. Desks bore the carved initials and profanities of students who viewed education as warfare. The windows, grimy with years of neglect, filtered the morning light into something gray and lifeless. When Principal Margaret Hoffman announced that yet another teacher would attempt to handle Class 3B, the faculty lounge fell silent. Veteran teachers exchanged knowing glances. The custodial staff placed bets on how long this one would last. Even the guidance counselors, typically optimistic souls, shook their heads in resignation. Sarah Chun arrived on a drizzly Tuesday morning. In October, carrying a worn leather satchel that had belonged to her grandmother and wearing a cardigan that seemed 2 sizes too large for her small frame. At 28, she possessed the kind of unassuming presence that made people forget she was in the room. Her voice, when she spoke at all, emerged as barely more than a whisper. During her brief interview, Principal Hoffman had to ask her to repeat herself 3 times. The decision to hire Sarah had been born of desperation rather than confidence. The substitute teacher pool had been exhausted. The district was threatening intervention. Sarah Chun, with her master's degree in literature and her impeccable references from suburban schools, seemed like a reasonable gamble. What the administration didn't know was that Sarah's previous positions had all been at small, well-funded private academies where discipline was rarely an issue and respect came automatically with the territory. Class 3B, however, operated by entirely different rules. The Kaufrog operator operated by entirely different rules. Roster read like a collection of cautionary tales. At the center of the chaos sat Tyler Morrison, a 17-year-old senior who had perfected the art of psychological warfare against authority figures. Tall and broad-shouldered, with calculating green eyes and a smirk that suggested he knew secrets about everyone, Tyler commanded the classroom like a general commanding troops. His methods were sophisticated, subtle, and devastatingly effective. Beside him sat his lieutenant, Ashley Rodriguez, whose sweet smile masked a razor-sharp intellect devoted entirely to disruption. Ashley possessed an uncanny ability to identify any teacher's weakness within minutes of meeting them. Her arsenal included fake tears, manufactured outrage, and a gift for turning any classroom discussion into chaos while maintaining an expression of innocent confusion. The third member of their triumvirate was Marcus Thompson, a quiet giant whose intimidating physical presence served as the group's enforcer. Marcus rarely spoke, but when he did, his deep voice carried weight. More often, he communicated through strategic silence, meaningful stares, and the occasional crack of knuckles that sounded like gunshots in the classroom's tense atmosphere. Together, they had perfected a systematic approach to teacher elimination. First came the testing phase. Small disruptions, whispered conversations, strategic bathroom breaks. If the teacher showed weakness, they escalated to phase 2, organized rebellion, coordinated defiance, and psychological pressure designed to create public humiliation. The final phase involved character assassination, parent complaints, and administrative pressure that inevitably led to resignation or transfer. They had never failed. When Sarah Chun walked into room 318 for the first time, she moved like someone trying not to disturb sleeping lions. Her footsteps were nearly silent against the worn linoleum. She set her satchel down gently, avoiding eye contact with the 28 students who watched her with the focused attention of predators sizing up prey. The morning routine at Riverside High was controlled chaos. Students filtered in gradually, their conversations a mix of weekend stories, social media drama, and speculation about the new teacher. Cell phones emerged despite the posted policies. Paper airplanes began their lazy flights across the room. Someone had already written teacher number 12 on the whiteboard in a mocking script. Sarah stood at the front of the classroom, hands clasped behind her back, waiting. She didn't call for attention. She didn't clear her throat or tap the desk. She simply waited, her presence so unobtrusive that several students seemed genuinely surprised when they noticed her standing there. Tyler Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying this new opponent with the careful attention of a chess master analyzing an opening move. Sarah's cardigan was beige, unremarkable. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, except for a thin silver watch that caught the light when she moved her wrist. Everything about her screamed vulnerability. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice so quiet that the students in the back rows strained to hear. A few exchanged glances. This was going to be easier than they'd expected. Ashley Rodriguez raised her hand with exaggerated politeness. "I'm sorry. I couldn't hear you. Could you speak up?" Sarah's cheeks colored slightly. "Good morning," she repeated, only marginally louder. Marcus Thompson chose that moment to drop his textbook. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Sarah jumped visibly, her hand flying to her chest. Several students snickered. "Sorry," Marcus rumbled, his tone suggesting anything but apology. Sarah nodded quickly, turning to write her name on the whiteboard with hands that trembled just enough for the front row to notice. Her handwriting was neat but small, as if she was trying to take up as little space as possible even on the board. "I'm Ms. Chun," she said, her back still to the class. "I'll be your English teacher." "For how long?" Tyler's question cut through the air with surgical precision. The class fell silent, waiting for her response. Sarah turned around, her face pale but determined. "For as long as you'll have me." The wrong answer. Tyler's smile widened. Ashley's eyes lit up with predatory interest. Marcus cracked his knuckles once, slowly, deliberately. The testing phase had begun. Over the next hour, Class 3B deployed their arsenal with practiced efficiency. Conversations started and stopped at random intervals. Pens were dropped with metronomic regularity. Students asked to use the bathroom in calculated succession, ensuring that the classroom door was opening and closing every few minutes. Ashley developed a sudden coughing fit that required extended attention. Tyler questioned every instruction. With mock confusion, his tone respectful enough to avoid direct confrontation, while making it clear that he considered her authority questionable at best. Through it all, Sarah Chun maintained her quiet composure. She answered questions patiently, even when they were clearly designed to waste time. She ignored the whispered conversations and the strategic disruptions. When Ashley's coughing fit reached theatrical proportions, Sarah simply offered her a bottle of water from her desk drawer and continued with the lesson. But the students noticed things. They noticed that Sarah's hands never quite stopped trembling. They noticed how she avoided direct eye contact, how she seemed to shrink into herself whenever the noise level rose. They noticed that her voice grew even quieter when challenged. As if volume might invite confrontation, she wasn't prepared to handle Dot by the end of the first period. Tyler Morrison had reached a conclusion. This teacher wouldn't last a week. She possessed none of the aggressive authority that might intimidate them, none of the cunning that might outmaneuver them, and none of the resilience that might outlast them. She was quite simply prey. The word spread through Riverside High like wildfire. By lunch, students from other classes were finding excuses to walk past room 318. The betting pool in the faculty lounge had reached unprecedented levels. Even the principal had begun drafting job postings for yet another replacement. Sarah Chun, meanwhile, spent her lunch break alone in her classroom, grading papers with mechanical precision while trying to steady her breathing. She had known this assignment would be challenging. The warnings had been clear, the reputation well established. But the reality of standing before Class 3B had been more overwhelming than she'd anticipated. She thought about her grandmother, whose leather satchel now sat on the desk beside her. Grandmother Chun had taught in rural schools during a time when teachers commanded automatic respect, when discipline was a given rather than a daily battle. The world had changed, but Sarah had inherited more than just the satchel. She had inherited something else, something that Class 3B hadn't yet discovered. As the afternoon wore on, the attacks intensified. Tyler Morrison orchestrated them with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony of chaos. Paper balls appeared as if by magic, sailing across the room whenever Sarah turned to the board. Whispered conversations bloomed and died like flowers. In fast forward, always ending just as she turned to address them. Ashley Rodriguez had perfected a look of wounded innocence that she deployed whenever Sarah's gaze lingered too long in her direction. The psychological pressure was relentless. Every time Sarah attempted to begin a lesson, some new disruption would derail her efforts. When she tried to address the behavior directly, her quiet voice was either ignored entirely or met with expressions of such convincing confusion that she began to doubt her own perceptions. By the final period of the day, Sarah Chun looked like a woman on the verge of collapse. Her cardigan hung loose on her shoulders. Her hair had begun to escape its ponytail. The trembling in her hands had become more pronounced, and her voice had grown so quiet that even the front row struggled to hear her instructions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tyler Morrison watched her with satisfaction. The kill was close now. One more push. One final coordinated assault, and room 318 would claim another victim. He caught Ashley's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. She understood. Marcus straightened in his chair, ready to play his part. What none of them realized was that quiet. People often see more than they let on. Sarah Chun had been observing too, cataloging behaviors, noting patterns, understanding dynamics that went far deeper than simple classroom disruption. The trembling hands, the quiet voice, the averted eyes, they had all been real, but they had also been useful. Sometimes the best way to understand an enemy is to let them believe they're winning. The final bell of the day was still 30 minutes away when Tyler Morrison decided to end the game. He stood up slowly, theatrically, drawing every eye in the classroom. "Miss Chun," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence, "I think we need to talk." Sarah Chun's eyes met Tyler Morrison's for the first time that day. The classroom held its breath, 28 students sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Tyler's confident stride toward the front of the room carried the weight of 3 years of victories over defeated teachers. "I think," Tyler continued, his voice deliberately measured, "that maybe you're not cut out for this job." Ashley Rodriguez shifted in her seat, positioning herself for maximum impact. She had perfected the art of the supportive witness, ready to corroborate whatever narrative Tyler was about to construct. Marcus Thompson remained motionless, but his presence loomed larger somehow, filling the space with unspoken threat. Sarah's response was barely audible. "Please return to your seat, Tyler." "See, that's the problem right there," Tyler said, stopping just short of Sarah's desk. "You ask instead of tell. You suggest instead of demand. This isn't a tea party, Ms. Chun. This is Riverside High." The classroom erupted in nervous laughter. Tyler fed off the energy, his confidence growing with each chuckle. He had performed this dance before, the public humiliation that would send yet another teacher running to Principal Hoffman's office with a resignation letter. But Sarah didn't move. She didn't step backward or reach for the phone to call for administrative support. Instead, she did something unexpected. She sat down in her chair, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Tyler's momentum faltered slightly. "This wasn't following the script. Are you even listening to me?" he demanded, his voice rising for the first time. "I hear you perfectly, Tyler," Sarah replied, her quiet tone somehow cutting through his bluster. "I'm waiting for you to finish." Ashley Rodriguez recognized the moment when the performance needed reinforcement. She stood up with theatrical indignation. "This is so unfair. Tyler's just trying to help you understand what we need in a teacher." "And what is it that you need?" Sarah asked, her question directed not at Ashley but at the entire classroom. The question hung in the air like an unexpected curveball. Students exchanged glances, suddenly unsure of their roles in this familiar drama. They had expected anger, tears, threats of detention, or principal visits. They hadn't expected genuine inquiry. "We need someone who can actually teach," Tyler shot back, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Someone who can handle a real classroom, not someone who looks like she's about to cry every time we breathe too loud." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And how many of your previous teachers met those qualifications?" The question was simple, but it carried an edge that made several students shift uncomfortably. Tyler's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "None of them," he admitted. "That's the point." "So in 3 years, 11 different teachers, and none of them were capable enough for Class 3B? "Exactly." Sarah stood up slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the room. When she spoke, her voice remained quiet, but something had changed in her posture, in the way she held her shoulders. "That's an interesting perspective, Tyler. 11 teachers, all failures. What does that suggest to you about the common denominator in this equation?" The classroom fell deadly silent. Tyler's confident smirk wavered as the implication of her words settled over the room like a cold front. "Are you saying it's our fault?" Ashley's voice carried a note of manufactured outrage, but beneath it lurked something else, uncertainty. "I'm not saying anything," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm asking you to think." Marcus Thompson spoke for the first time that day, his deep voice rumbling through the tension. "Teachers are supposed to teach. If they can't handle us, that's on them." Sarah turned her attention to Marcus, her quiet gaze steady and unwavering. "Tell me, Marcus, what subject were you hoping to learn this year?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "English literature. Poetry, prose, critical thinking, writing skills. What aspect of English were you most excited to explore?" Marcus blinked, clearly struggling with the unexpected direction of the conversation. I don't know. I guess. Writing, maybe. What kind of writing interests you?" The giant of a student looked around the classroom, as if seeking permission. "To engage honestly. Stories, I guess. Like real stories about real things." Sarah smiled for the first time that day, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "That's wonderful. Stories are how we make sense of the world, how we connect with each other across time and space." Tyler Morrison watched this exchange with growing alarm. The conversation was spiraling away from his control, moving into territory he hadn't mapped. What does any of this have to do with whether you can actually teach? Sarah returned her attention to Tyler, but her demeanor had shifted subtly. The nervousness was still there, but it was joined by something else, purpose. Everything, she said simply. Because teaching isn't about domination or control. It's about connection. It's about finding what matters to each student and building bridges to new understanding. That's just pretty words, Tyler scoffed, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction, is it? Sarah moved to the whiteboard and began writing, her handwriting still small, but somehow more confident. Let me tell you what I see when I look at this classroom. She wrote Tyler's name first, Tyler Morrison. Natural leader, quick wit, protective of his position, but also protective of his classmates. Challenges authority not out of malice, but out of a need to test whether that authority is worthy of respect. Tyler's face flushed red. You don't know anything about me. Sarah continued writing, Ashley Rodriguez. Highly intelligent, emotionally perceptive, skilled at reading social dynamics. Uses performance as both shield and sword, because genuine. Vulnerability feels too risky. Ashley's manufactured confidence cracked visibly. Stop it, Marcus Thompson. Thoughtful observer, natural storyteller, physically intimidating but intellectually curious. Uses silence as protection, because words have been weaponized against him before. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with, I sound like breaking glass. I said stop it. But Sarah wasn't finished. She moved through the classroom systematically, writing names and observations that cut through carefully constructed facades like surgical instruments. Each description was quiet, precise, and devastatingly accurate. Jennifer Walsh sits in the back corner, never participates. But I've seen her taking notes when she thinks no one is watching. You love learning, don't you, Jennifer? You just don't trust it to be safe here. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. She nodded almost imperceptibly. David Kim makes jokes to deflect attention from the fact that you're probably the smartest person in this room. You're bored, aren't you? Academically. Hungry but socially cautious. David stopped mid-laugh, his expression sobering as he stared at Sarah with new attention. One by one, Sarah dismantled the artificial hierarchy that had governed room 318 for 3 years. She revealed the scared children hiding behind aggressive facades, the intelligent minds masked by performative disruption, the genuine human needs that had been buried under layers of defensive behavior. Tyler Morrison found himself backing toward his desk, his carefully constructed authority crumbling. With each quiet observation, You think you're so smart, he said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. No, Sarah replied, setting down her marker and turning to face the class. I think you're smart. All of you. Brilliant, creative, complex human beings who have learn to use your intelligence as a weapon because no one has shown you how to use it as a tool. The classroom was utterly silent now, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of recognition, of walls cracking, of possibilities opening. Ashley Rodriguez was the first to break. How did you how did you know about my parents? Sarah's expression softened. I didn't write anything about your parents, Ashley. But if you'd like to talk about them, I'm here to listen. They're getting divorced, Ashley whispered, the admission falling from her lips like a stone dropping into still water. They fight all the time. I come to school and pretend everything's fine because if I don't perform happiness, I might forget what it feels like. The confession hung in the air, raw and honest and completely unlike anything that had ever been shared in room 318 before. Tyler Morrison stared at Ashley in shock. In 3 years of friendship and alliance, he had never heard her speak with such naked honesty. Ash, you never said ... Because you never asked, she replied, turning to look at him with tears streaming down her face. None of us ever ask. We just perform and attack and defend and pretend we're not all falling apart inside. Marcus Thompson slowly sat back down, his massive frame somehow looking smaller, more vulnerable. My dad left when I was 8, he said quietly. My mom works 3 jobs to keep us afloat. I learned to look scary because scared kids don't survive in my neighborhood. The dominoes were falling now, 3 years of careful pretense collapsing. Under the weight of sudden honesty, Jennifer Walsh raised her hand tentatively. My family moves a lot because of my dad's job. I stopped trying to make friends because it hurts too much when you have to leave them behind. David Kim nodded slowly. I test out of everything academically, but I've never been invited to a single party or social event. I make jokes because it's easier than admitting I'm lonely. Sarah Chun watched her students with eyes that glistened with unshed tears. This was why she had become a teacher, for moments like this when walls came down and real learning could begin. But Tyler Morrison wasn't ready to surrender his position. The revelation that his carefully constructed kingdom was built on a foundation of shared pain rather than genuine respect shook him to his core. He needed to regain control, to re-establish the order that had defined his identity for 3 years. This is all very touching, he said, his voice sharp with desperation. But it doesn't change anything. You're still just another substitute teacher who'll be gone in a week. We've heard all this before. Sarah turned to him with an expression of infinite patience. Have you, Tyler? When was the last time a teacher asked what you needed instead of demanding what they wanted? The question hit its mark. Tyler's face went through a series of expressions: anger, confusion, vulnerability, and finally, something that looked almost like hope. Never, he admitted quietly. Then let's start there, Sarah said. What do you need, Tyler Morrison? And for the first time in 3 years, the king of room 318 didn't have an answer. The silence that followed Sarah's question stretched through room 318 like a taut wire. Tyler Morrison stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, grappling with a question no adult had ever posed to him. What did he need? The concept felt foreign, almost dangerous. Sarah moved to her desk and pulled out a small wooden box, weathered and carved with intricate patterns. She set it gently on the corner of her desk where everyone could see it. This belonged to my grandmother, she said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. She was a teacher in rural China during some of the most difficult times in that country's history. Students came to her classroom hungry, scared, angry. Many had lost family members. Some hadn't spoken in months. The class leaned forward almost unconsciously. Even Tyler found himself drawn into the quiet narrative. The school had no supplies, no books, barely enough space for everyone to sit. But my grandmother understood something that took me years to learn. Sarah opened the box, revealing a collection of small, smooth stones, each one different in color and texture. She understood that before you can teach someone's mind, you have to reach their heart. Ashley wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. What did she do? Sarah picked up one of the stones, a deep blue one that caught the afternoon light streaming through the grimy windows. She gave each student a stone, not as a reward or punishment, but as a promise. She told them that no matter how broken they felt, how lost or angry or afraid, they carried something precious inside them that could never be taken away. Marcus Thompson shifted in his seat, his usual intimidating presence replaced by something softer, more curious. Did it work? Some of her students became doctors, teachers, engineers. Others became farmers, shopkeepers, parents. But every single one of them learned that their worth wasn't determined by their circumstances or their past mistakes. Sarah set the stone down gently. They learned that transformation is always possible, but it has to start from the inside. David. Kim raised his hand tentatively. Miss Chun, why are you telling us this? Sarah's smile was gentle, but her eyes were steady. Because I see the same thing in all of you that my grandmother saw in her students. Potential buried under pain. Brilliance hidden behind defense mechanisms. Hearts that want to trust but have learned that trust is dangerous. Tyler Morrison felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation both uncomfortable and oddly relieving. But we've been awful to you. To every teacher who's tried to help us. Yes, you have, Sarah agreed without a trace of condemnation, and I'm curious about why. The honesty of her response surprised everyone, including Tyler. He had expected denial, justification, or accusation. Instead, he got genuine curiosity, because ... Tyler started, then stopped, struggling with words that felt too big for his mouth. Because if we hurt you first, then when you leave, it doesn't hurt us. The admission hung in the air like a confession in church. Ashley nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in Tyler's words. Marcus looked down at his hands, those same hands that had intimidated so many teachers, and saw them trembling slightly. Sarah moved closer to Tyler, but not in a threatening way. Her approach was careful, respectful of his space. Tyler, how many teachers have genuinely hurt you by leaving? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? I mean, beyond the inconvenience of changing classrooms and learning new rules, how many of those teachers did you actually care about? Losing? Tyler's confident facade crumbled completely. His shoulders sagged as the weight of the question settled on him. None of them, he whispered. I never let myself care about any of them. So you've been protecting yourself from a pain you've never actually experienced. The logic was inescapable, and Tyler Morrison, for all his bravado, was fundamentally logical. He sank into his chair as if the revelation had physical weight. Ashley Rodriguez found her voice. Miss Chun, what makes you different? How do we know you won't just leave like the rest of them when things get hard? Sarah returned to the wooden box and lifted out another stone, this one rough and scarred but shot through with veins of gold. In Japanese culture, there's a concept called kintsugi. When a piece of pottery breaks, instead of throwing it away or hiding the damage, they repair it with gold. The cracks become part of the beauty, proof that the piece has survived and become stronger. She held the stone up to the light, and the golden veins seemed to glow. I'm not here to fix you because you're not broken. I'm here to help you see that your scars, your struggles, your defensive mechanisms, they're all part of your story. And every story has the potential for a beautiful next chapter. Jennifer Walsh, who had been silent in her corner for most of the year, suddenly spoke up. But what if we don't know how to write that next chapter? What if we've been the villain in our own story for so long that we don't remember how to be anything else? The question was so profound that even Tyler turned to look at Jennifer with new respect. Sarah set the stone down and moved to the whiteboard. Again, but this time she didn't write names or observations. Instead, she drew a simple tree. Jennifer, that's perhaps the most important question anyone can ask. The beautiful thing about stories is that every moment is a chance to choose who you want to be next. She added roots to the tree, deep and complex. Your past doesn't disappear. It becomes the foundation that feeds your growth. She drew branches reaching upward, some twisted, some straight, all reaching toward the light. But your future is unwritten. Every choice you make, every word you speak, every action you take is a chance to author the person you're becoming. Marcus Thompson stood up slowly, his movement careful and deliberate. Ms. Chun, I need to tell you something. The class turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. I've been angry for so long, I forgot what it felt like not to be angry. My size, my voice, the way I look, I learned to use all of it to make people afraid of me because I was tired of being afraid of everything else. Sarah nodded encouragingly. What are you afraid of, Marcus? Of not being smart enough. Of not mattering. Of people seeing through all this. He gestured to his imposing frame. and realizing there's just a scared kid inside who doesn't know how to ask for help. The honesty was raw, unfiltered, and it created a ripple effect through the classroom. Other students began to shift, to lean forward, to make eye contact with each other for perhaps the first time all year. David Kim cleared his throat. I make jokes because if people are laughing, they're not judging. But I'm tired of being the entertainment instead of being seen as a person. I perform confidence because I'm terrified that if people see how insecure I really am, they'll have proof that I'm not worth loving, Ashley added, her voice thick with emotion. One by one, the students of room 318 began to dismantle the personas they had constructed, revealing the vulnerable, complex, beautiful human beings beneath. Sarah listened to each confession with the same quiet attention, never judging, never trying to fix, simply witnessing their courage. But Tyler Morrison remained silent, watching his classmates transform before his eyes. As their self-appointed leader, he felt responsible for the walls they had built, the pain they had inflicted, the years of learned helplessness they had cultivated. This is my fault, he said suddenly, his voice cutting through a particularly poignant confession from a girl named Rebecca about her struggle with anxiety. I created this. I taught everyone to attack first, to never show weakness, to treat every new teacher like an enemy. Sarah turned to him with an expression of infinite compassion. Tyler, taking responsibility is the first step toward healing. But responsibility isn't the same as blame. What's the difference? Sarah picked up the golden veined stone again. Blame is about the past, about assigning fault for what's already happened. Responsibility is about the future, about choosing how you respond to what's in front of you right now. Tyler looked around the classroom at his classmates, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time. He saw Ashley's red-rimmed eyes and realized he had never asked why she sometimes came to school looking exhausted. He saw Marcus's careful posture and understood that the big guy wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. He was trying to make himself smaller. He saw Jennifer's hopeful expression and remembered all the times he had shut down her attempts to participate in class discussions. I want to be responsible, he said quietly. I want to help fix what I helped break. Sarah smiled, and this time her smile was radiant. Tyler Morrison, that might be the most mature thing any student has ever said to me. The transformation happening in room 318 was remarkable, but Sarah knew that revelation was only the beginning. Real change would require practice, patience, and the courage to keep choosing growth even when it felt uncomfortable. She looked at the clock and realized that class was nearly over. Soon these students would leave this bubble of honesty and return to a school environment that awarded the very behaviors they were trying to change. Before you go, she said, moving back to the wooden box, I want to offer each of you something. She began distributing the stones, one to each student. As she placed Tyler's stone in his palm, a dark gray one with silver flecks that caught the light, she spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. Leadership isn't about control, Tyler. It's about service. You have the power to help your classmates become the best versions of themselves. As the final bell rang and students began to gather their belongings, the usual chaos was absent. Instead, there was a quiet purposefulness, a sense that something significant had shifted. Tyler Morrison was the last to leave. He stood at Sarah's desk, rolling the stone between his fingers. Ms. Chun, he said, I don't know how to be the person you think I can be. Sarah looked up from her papers with eyes full of warmth and certainty. Tyler, you don't have to know how, you just have to be willing to try. As he walked toward the door, Tyler turned back one more time. Will you really stay? Even when we mess up again? Sarah's answer was simple, quiet, and absolutely certain. I'm not going anywhere. 4. The first time in 3 years, Tyler Morrison believed that someone meant it when they said they wouldn't leave. And that belief, small as it was, felt like the beginning of everything. The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness in the hallways of Riverside High. Students who normally rushed past room 318 found themselves slowing down, peering through the doorway with curious expressions. Word had spread that something extraordinary had happened in Notoria's classroom, though the details remained mysteriously vague. Sarah Chun arrived early, as had become her habit, but today she wasn't alone. Tyler Morrison sat in the hallway outside room 318, his back against the lockers, turning the gray stone over and over in his hands. "You're here early," Sarah observed, unlocking the classroom door. "Couldn't sleep," Tyler admitted. "Keep thinking about what you said yesterday, about leadership and service." He looked up at her with eyes that seemed older somehow. "I've been a leader, but I've never served anyone except my own ego." Sarah propped the door open and gestured for him to follow her inside. "Leadership and service aren't separate things, Tyler. True leadership is service. It's about using your influence to lift others up, not to maintain your own position." As Sarah arranged papers on her desk, Tyler wandered to the whiteboard where the tree drawing from yesterday still remained. Someone had added to it overnight, small flowers and leaves in different colored chalk, each one unique. "Who did this?" he asked. "I'm not sure, but it's beautiful, isn't it?" Sometimes the most meaningful art happens when people feel safe enough to contribute without taking credit. The first bell rang, and students began filtering into room 318. But the atmosphere was different from any morning in the classroom's recent history. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. Students made eye contact with each other instead of staring at phones. Ashley Rodriguez actually smiled at Jennifer Walsh, who smiled back tentatively. Marcus Thompson entered last, carrying something in his large hands. He approached Sarah's desk with uncharacteristic nervousness. "Miss Chun, I wrote something last night, after class. Would you ... could you maybe read it?" Sarah accepted the folded piece of notebook paper with the reverence usually reserved. "For valuable manuscripts. Of course, Marcus. Thank you for sharing it with me." As students settled into their seats, Sarah noticed small changes everywhere. David Kim had moved from his usual back corner to a seat in the middle of the room. Jennifer Walsh had her notebook open and ready, no longer hiding behind her hair. Even the classroom's chronic disruptions, the paper airplane launchers and pencil droppers, sat with hands folded, attention focused forward. "Good morning," Sarah said, and this time her voice, while still gentle, carried easily to every corner of the room. "Good morning, Miss Chen," came the response, not shouted but genuinely warm. Tyler raised his hand. "Miss Chun, I've been thinking about what we talked about yesterday, and I have an idea." Sarah nodded encouragingly. "I'd like to hear it. What if we made room 318 a place where other students could come when they're struggling? Like not just for English class, but as a safe space. A place where people could be real instead of pretending all the time." The suggestion hung in the air while Sarah considered its implications. Around the room, students exchanged glances that spoke of possibility rather than skepticism. Ashley leaned forward in her seat. "Tyler's right. Yesterday, for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe in school. What if other kids could have that too?" "It's an ambitious idea," Sarah said carefully. "It would require a lot of trust, a lot of commitment from everyone. Are you prepared for that kind of responsibility?" Marcus raised his hand, still clutching the paper he'd given Sarah. "I've been the muscle for intimidation for 3 years. Maybe it's time I used my size to protect people instead of scaring them." David Kim spoke up from his new position. "I could help with tutoring. I know I make jokes all the time, but I actually understand most of this stuff. Maybe I could help other students who are struggling academically." Jennifer Walsh's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the new atmosphere of the classroom, it carried clearly. "I could listen. I'm good at that. Sometimes people just need someone to hear them." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with witnessing young people discover their capacity for service. These are beautiful ideas. But before we can help others, we need to make sure we're building something real. Here, trust has to be earned day by day, choice by choice. She moved to the whiteboard and began writing new words beside the tree drawing. Let's start with some agreements. Not rules imposed from outside, but commitments we make to each other. Tyler stood up, and for a moment Sarah tensed, remembering how his standing had been a signal for disruption just 24 hours ago. But his posture was different now, open, collaborative, rather than confrontational. "Can I suggest one?" he asked. Of course. We listen before we judge. Actually listen, not just wait for our turn to talk. Sarah wrote it on the board. What else? Ashley raised her hand. We tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. We ask for help when we need it instead of pretending we don't, added David. Jennifer's contribution was quieter, but no less important. We celebrate each other's growth instead of tearing each other down. Marcus's deep voice rumbled through the room. We protect this space. No one gets bullied here. No one gets made fun of for being vulnerable. As the list grew, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening. Students who had never spoken in class before were raising their hands, contributing ideas, building on each other's suggestions. The dynamic had shifted from teacher-directed to truly collaborative. "Miss Chun," said a girl named Rachel who rarely participated, "what if we had a way for people to share things anonymously? Like if someone needed help but was too scared to ask directly." Sarah paused in her writing. "That's a thoughtful idea, Rachel. What would that look like?" Rachel glanced around the room, drawing courage from the supportive faces surrounding her. "Maybe we could have a box like your grandmother's stone box where people could write notes. Not just problems, but also good things. Like if someone did something kind or if someone was struggling and needed support." Tyler's eyes lit up with understanding. Like a positive gossip network instead of a destructive one. "Exactly," Rachel said, smiling for perhaps the first time all semester. Sarah set down her marker and looked around the room at faces that had been transformed not just by her presence, but by their own choices to be vulnerable, to be real, to be better versions of themselves. "I want to read you something," she said, picking up the paper Marcus had given her earlier. "Marcus wrote this last night, and he's given me permission to share it." Marcus nodded, though his face reddened slightly with nervousness. Sarah began to read in her clear, gentle voice. "I used to think strength meant making people afraid of you. My dad left when I was little, and my mom told me I had to be the man of the house. I thought that meant being hard, never showing weakness, never letting anyone see that I was just a kid who missed his father and didn't understand why he wasn't good enough to make him stay. I got big early, and I learned that big meant powerful. And powerful meant safe. If people were afraid of me, they couldn't hurt me first. But yesterday, I realized that I'd been so busy protecting myself from pain that I forgot how to feel anything else. Ms. Chun helped me remember that strength isn't about making people afraid. It's about making them feel safe. I want to learn how to do that. I want to be the kind of person who uses his size to shelter people from storms instead of being the storm himself." The classroom was utterly silent when Sarah finished reading. Marcus sat with his head down, shoulders trembling slightly. Without hesitation, Ashley got up from her seat and walked over to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That was beautiful, Marcus," she said quietly. One by one, other students followed. Not in a dramatic rush, but in a quiet procession of support. They didn't crowd him or overwhelm him, but they made sure he knew he wasn't alone. Tyler remained in his seat, but his voice carried clearly across the room. "Marcus, I'm sorry I never asked you how you were doing. I just assumed that because you were big and strong, You didn't need anything from anyone. I was wrong." Marcus looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never told you I needed anything. I never told anyone." "Well, now we know," Jennifer said simply. "And knowing changes everything." Sarah watched this exchange with a heart so full, it felt like it might burst. This was why she had become a teacher, for moments like this when young people discovered their capacity for compassion, their ability to heal each other through simple acts of recognition and acceptance. But she also knew that transformation was fragile in its early stages. The agreements they had written on the board were beautiful, but living them out day after day would require constant choice, constant recommitment. "There's something else we need to talk about," Sarah said gently, drawing the class's attention back to her. "What happens when this gets tested? Because it will get tested. There will be days when old habits feel easier than new choices. There will be moments when someone disappoints you, when trust feels dangerous again." Tyler nodded soberly. "You're saying we need to prepare for the hard parts. I'm saying that real transformation happens not in the breakthrough moments, but in the ordinary Tuesday when you're tired and frustrated and someone pushes your buttons. The magic isn't in feeling different. It's in choosing to act differently, even when you don't feel like it." Ashley raised her hand thoughtfully. "So how do we do that? How do we stay committed when things get difficult?" Sarah smiled and moved to her desk, opening the wooden box once more. This time, instead of stones, she pulled out a small leather journal, worn and filled with pages of careful handwriting. "This is my grandmother's teaching journal. She wrote in it every day for 40 years. Do you know what she wrote about most often? Her successes?" "Guess David. Her mistakes," Sarah replied. "Her failures, her moments of doubt, her struggles with difficult students. But more importantly, she wrote about what she learned from each challenge, how she chose to respond differently the next time." She held up the journal so everyone could see it. "Growth isn't a destination. It's a practice. And like any practice, it requires daily commitment, even when, especially when, you don't feel like it." The bell rang, signaling the end of class. But for the first time all year, no one rushed for the door. Students gathered their belongings slowly, reluctant to leave the safe space they had created together. As Tyler passed Sarah's desk, he paused. "Miss Chun, do you think we can really do this? Create something different here?" Sarah looked around. The room had faces that had been transformed by their own courage. To be vulnerable, to be real, to be better than they had been before. "Tyler," she said quietly, "I think you already have." 2 weeks had passed since the transformation began in room 318, and the changes were becoming noticeable throughout Riverside High. Students from other classes lingered in the hallway outside Sarah's classroom, drawn by an energy they couldn't quite name. Teachers whispered in the faculty lounge about the mysterious quiet that had settled over the once chaotic room. Even Principal Hoffman had begun to take notice, but change, as Sarah had warned, rarely goes unchallenged. It started on a Wednesday morning when Blake Peterson, a junior with a reputation for stirring up trouble, decided to test the new atmosphere of room 318. Blake wasn't a member of the class, but word had spread about the touchy-feely nonsense happening in the notorious classroom. And he'd made it his mission to prove that the transformation was nothing more than temporary weakness. He appeared in the doorway during the second period, ostensibly looking for a friend, but his real purpose became clear when he spotted the agreement list still written on the whiteboard. "Wow," Blake said loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he read aloud. "We listen before we judge. We tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable." He turned to face the class with a mocking grin. "What is this? Kindergarten therapy?" The room fell silent. Tyler Morrison felt his old instincts surge to the surface. The familiar anger, the need to assert dominance, the urge to meet mockery with intimidation. For a moment, he started to rise from his seat, his face flushing with the heat of confrontation. But then he caught sight of Marcus Thompson, whose massive frame had tensed like a coiled spring. Marcus's jaw was clenched, his hands balled into fists, every muscle in his body preparing for the kind of response that had defined him for years. Tyler could see the internal war playing out on his friend's face, the old Marcus who would have physically removed Blake from the room, and the new Marcus who was learning to use his strength differently. Sarah Chun remained seated at her desk, her expression calm but watchful. She didn't intervene, didn't rush to defend the sacred space her students had created. Instead, she waited, trusting them to handle the challenge in whatever way they chose. Ashley Rodriguez was the first to respond, and her choice surprised everyone, including herself. "Blake," she said, her voice steady and clear, "you're right. This probably does seem weird from the outside." Blake blinked, clearly expecting defensiveness or anger. Finally, someone with sense. "But," Ashley continued, standing up slowly, "I'm curious about something. What brings you here? I mean, you don't have English this period, and you're not friends with anyone in this class. So what made you walk all the way across school to come here and criticize something you don't understand?" The question hung in the air like a gentle trap. Blake's confident smirk faltered slightly as he realized he was being asked to examine his own motivations, rather than simply being told to leave. "I heard you all went soft," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I wanted to see for myself." David Kim leaned forward in his seat. "What does going soft mean to you, Blake? Because from where I'm sitting, it takes more courage to be honest about your feelings than it does to hide behind insults." Jennifer Walsh, who would have cowered in her corner just weeks earlier, spoke up with quiet confidence. "Blake, have you ever been in a place where you felt completely safe to be yourself? Where you didn't have to perform or pretend or attack to protect yourself?" Blake looked around the room, suddenly aware that 28 pairs of eyes were focused on him, with curiosity rather than hostility. It was deeply unsettling. He had come here expecting a fight, prepared for the familiar dance of aggression and defense. Instead, he found himself being invited into genuine conversation. "That's not how the real world works," he said weakly. Marcus Thompson finally spoke, his deep voice rumbling through the classroom with surprising gentleness. "Blake, I used to think the same thing. I thought the world was just people hurting each other before they could get hurt first. But maybe we get to choose what kind of world we create in the spaces we control." Tyler Morrison made a decision that would have been impossible just 2 weeks earlier. He stood up and walked toward Blake, but his approach was open, non-threatening. "Blake, I know you came here to prove something. Maybe that we're weak or fake or naive, and maybe you're right about some of that. Maybe vulnerability is a kind of weakness. But I've learned something these past 2 weeks." He stopped a few feet away from Blake, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to respect personal space. "I've learned that the old way, the way where we hurt people to prove we couldn't be hurt, that wasn't strength. It was exhausting. I was so tired of fighting everyone all the time, of never being able to let my guard down, of treating every new person like an enemy." Blake stared at Tyler, clearly struggling with this unexpected response. "But people will take advantage of you if you're not tough." "Some will," Tyler agreed. "But some won't. And the ones who don't take advantage, those are the people worth building something with." Sarah Chun watched this exchange with pride so profound it almost brought tears to her eyes. Her students were doing exactly what she had hoped. They were choosing to respond to challenges with wisdom rather than reaction, with curiosity rather than defensiveness. But Blake wasn't finished. His discomfort with the genuine responses he was receiving made him push harder, more cruelly. "This is all going to fall apart, you know," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Ms. Chun is just another substitute teacher. She'll be gone in a few weeks, and you'll all go back to being the same losers you were before. Except now you'll be losers who share their feelings. The words hit their mark. Several students flinched visibly. Jennifer Walsh looked down at her desk, doubt creeping into her expression. Even Marcus seemed to shrink slightly, old insecurities surfacing like shadows. But Ashley Rodriguez stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "You're probably right about Miss Chen leaving eventually," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Most teachers do. But you're wrong about everything else." She turned to address her classmates as much as Blake. "What we've built here isn't dependent on one person. It's not Ms. Chun's classroom anymore, it's ours. We chose to trust each other. We chose to be honest. We chose to support instead of tear down, and those choices don't disappear when she leaves." Marcus nodded slowly, finding his voice again. "Blake, even if everything falls apart tomorrow, I'm not the same person I was 2 weeks ago. I can't go back to not knowing that I have the choice to be kind." David Kin stood up, his usual humor replaced by surprising intensity. "And I can't go back to pretending that making people laugh is more important than making real connections." One by one, students began to stand, not in aggression, but in solidarity. Each one spoke briefly about what they had gained, what they had learned, what they refused to give up. Tyler was the last to speak, and his words were directed as much to his own doubts as to Blake's challenges. "Blake, maybe you're right that this will all fall apart. Maybe we'll fail. Maybe we'll hurt each other and disappoint each other and go back to old patterns. But for the first time in my life, I think something is worth fighting for instead of against." The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of decision, of commitment, of young people choosing who they wanted to be in the face of cynicism and challenge. Blake Peterson looked around the room one more time, his expression cycling through confusion, frustration, and something that might have been longing. Finally, he shook his head. "You're all crazy," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. As he turned to leave, Sarah Chun spoke for the first time since he'd entered the room. "Blake," she said quietly, "you're welcome here anytime you decide you're tired of fighting." He paused in the doorway, his shoulders tense, then walked away without responding. After he left, the classroom remained quiet for several long minutes. Students looked at each other, processing what had just happened, what they had just accomplished together. "How do you think we did?" Jennifer asked nervously. Sarah stood up from her desk and moved to the whiteboard, where she added a new line. "To their agreements, we extend grace to those who challenge us, knowing they may be fighting battles we can't see." "You did beautifully," she said, turning to face her students. "You proved that transformation isn't just about feeling different. It's about acting differently when it matters most." Tyler slumped back into his seat, suddenly exhausted. "It's harder than I thought it would be. Choosing the difficult response instead of the easy one." "Growth always is," Sarah replied gently. "But did you notice something? You didn't do it alone. When one person struggled, others stepped up. When doubt crept in, someone else provided strength. That's how lasting change happens, in community, with support, through shared commitment." Ashley raised her hand thoughtfully. "Ms. Chun, what do we do about the students like Blake? The ones who aren't ready for this but who might need it most?" Sarah smiled, recognizing the question as evidence of her students' expanding hearts and growing wisdom. "We keep the door open," she said simply. "We keep modeling a different way of being. And we trust that when someone is ready to stop fighting the world, they'll remember that there's a place where they can lay down their weapons." Marcus Thompson looked out the window where Blake had disappeared into the crowded hallway. "I hope he comes back," he said quietly. "Me too," Tyler agreed. "Because if we can help someone like Blake, maybe we really can change more than just this classroom." Sarah looked around at her students, her former bullies who had become healers, her angry children who had chosen courage, her defensive Warriors who had learned that greatest strength sometimes lies in laying down your sword. "Tyler," she said, "I think you already are." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew their greatest test was still ahead. Because change, once it begins, tends to spread. And not everyone would welcome the transformation that was beginning to ripple out from room 318 into the broader world of Riverside High. The change in room 318 had begun to spread through Riverside High like ripples in a still pond, and by the fourth week, those ripples had reached the attention of people who weren't entirely pleased with the transformation. It started in the teacher's lounge during lunch on a Friday. Victoria Hartwell, a veteran English teacher with 30 years of experience and a reputation for rigid discipline, slammed her coffee mug down on the table hard enough to make the sugar packets jump. "This is ridiculous," she announced to the room at large. "I've been hearing from my students that Chun is running some kind of therapy session instead of teaching English. Students are crying in class, sharing personal stories, hugging each other. What's next? Meditation circles." Several teachers looked up from their lunches, the tension in Victoria's voice commanding attention. Margaret Hoffman, the principal, paused in the doorway, sensing conflict brewing. "I walked past her classroom yesterday," continued Victoria, "and they had moved all the desks into a circle. A circle! How are you supposed to maintain classroom authority when you're sitting in a touchy-feely circle with teenagers?" Robert Martinez, a younger math teacher, shifted uncomfortably. "Victoria, I've heard good things about what's happening in room 318. The students seem more engaged. More ... More emotional," Victoria interrupted. "More dependent on feelings instead of facts. These kids need structure, discipline, and clear boundaries. They don't need some substitute teacher convincing them that their personal problems are more important than academic achievement." Principal Hoffman stepped fully into the lounge, her expression carefully neutral. "Victoria, what exactly are you concerned about? Because from an administrative standpoint, the behavioral issues from room 318 have completely disappeared. For the first time in 3 years, I'm not getting daily incident reports from that classroom." "That's exactly my point," Victoria said, her voice rising. "Those students learn to behave through consequences, through clear expectations, through understanding that there are rules in the real world. Now they're being coddled, told that their feelings matter more than following directions." Lisa Park, the school counselor, looked up from her salad with interest. "Victoria, I'm curious about something. In your 30 years of teaching, how many of your former students have stayed in touch with you? How many have told you that your class changed their life in a meaningful way?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's face flushed red, and her jaw tightened visibly. "That's not the point of education," she snapped. "I'm not here to be their friend or their therapist. I'm here to teach English literature and prepare them for standardized tests in college." "But what if it could be both?" asked Sarah Chun quietly from the doorway. Every head in the teacher's lounge turned toward her. Sarah stood with her usual understated presence, holding a stack of student papers and wearing that same oversized cardigan that had become her signature. But something in her posture, in the way she held her shoulders, suggested a confidence that hadn't been there a month ago. Victoria Hartwell rose from her chair like a general preparing for battle. "Miss Chun, I think we need to have a conversation about appropriate classroom management and academic standards." "I'd welcome that conversation," Sarah replied, stepping into the room and setting her papers down on the table. "But first, I'd like to share something with all of you." She pulled out a folder and opened it to reveal a collection of essays, each one marked with careful comments in red ink. "These are literary analysis papers from my students. They were assigned to write about a character who overcomes adversity. The requirements were standard: thesis statement, supporting evidence, proper citation, 5-paragraph format." Victoria crossed her arms. "And?" And these are some of the most insightful, well-written essays I've read in 15 years of teaching, Sarah said simply. Tyler Morrison wrote a brilliant analysis of Santiago from The Old Man and the Sea, connecting the character's persistence in the face of defeat to his own experience, learning to lead through service rather than intimidation. Ashley Rodriguez explored the theme of identity in Their Eyes Were Watching God, drawing parallels between Janie's journey of self-discovery and her own process of learning to value herself beyond her ability to perform for others. She pulled out another paper. Marcus Thompson wrote about Atticus Finch, but instead of the typical analysis of moral courage, he examined the character's quiet strength and how true power comes from protecting others rather than dominating them. Principle. Hoffman moved closer to examine the papers. May I? Sarah handed her Tyler's essay, and Margaret Hoffman's eyebrows rose as she read. This is remarkably sophisticated analysis. The writing is clear, the arguments are well supported, and the personal connections enhance rather than detract from the academic content. That's impossible, Victoria said flatly. Tyler Morrison can barely string together a coherent sentence. I had him 2 years ago, and he spent most of class time disrupting other students. You're right, Sarah agreed. He did, but people change when they're given a reason to care about what they're learning. Lisa Park, the counselor, leaned forward with interest. Sarah, what's your secret? I've been trying to reach some of these students for years. Sarah sat down at the table, her movement drawing everyone into a closer circle, whether they intended it or not. There's no secret, she said quietly. I just started with the assumption that every behavior has a purpose. Every defense mechanism is protecting something vulnerable, and every student has something valuable to contribute. That's exactly the problem, Victoria interjected. You're enabling their excuses instead of holding them accountable for their choices. Actually, Sarah replied, I hold them more accountable than they've ever been held before. But I hold them accountable to their potential, not just to compliance. She pulled out her grandmother's journal, the worn leather cover catching the fluorescent light of the teacher's lounge. My grandmother taught in China during some of the most difficult periods in that country's history. She had students who came to school hungry, traumatized, angry. She could have focused on maintaining order, on forcing compliance, on preparing them for standardized assessments. Instead, she focused on helping them discover who they were capable of becoming. Robert Martinez leaned forward. What happened to her students? They thrived, Sarah said simply. Not because she lowered her standards, but because she raised their belief in themselves. When students trust that you see their potential, they'll work harder to live up to it than they ever will to avoid punishment. Victoria Hartwell was not convinced. That's a lovely philosophy, Ms. Chun, but it doesn't prepare students for the real world. The real world doesn't care about their feelings or their potential. It cares about results, about following directions, about meeting expectations. Victoria, said Principal Hoffman thoughtfully, what if those two things aren't mutually exclusive? What if helping students develop emotional intelligence and self-awareness actually helps them achieve better academic results? I'd like to show you something, Sarah said, reaching for another folder. These are the standardized test practice scores from room 318, from before I arrived and from last week. She spread the data across the table, and the improvement was dramatic. Reading comprehension scores had increased by an average of 15 points. Writing scores had improved even more significantly. But most remarkably, the attendance rate for room 318 had gone from 60% to 97%. Robert Martinez whistled softly. How is that possible? Students learn better when they feel safe, Sarah explained. When they're not spending all their energy on defense mechanisms, on maintaining facades, on fighting with each other and their teachers, that energy becomes available for actual learning. Victoria studied the data with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. This could be a fluke. A temporary improvement that won't sustain. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. Which is why I've been documenting everything. Daily. Observations, weekly reflections, student self-assessments. The transformation is real, but it requires constant choice, constant recommitment. She opened her grandmother's journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. My grandmother wrote something that I think about every day. A teacher's job is not to fill empty vessels, but to kindle fires that will burn long after the student leaves. The classroom. Lisa Park nodded thoughtfully. Sarah, I'm curious about something. How do you handle it when students challenge the new dynamic? When they test whether this safe space you've created is real? Sarah smiled, thinking of Blake Peterson's visit the week before. That's actually when the real learning happens. When students are given the opportunity to choose their response to conflict, when they practice responding with wisdom instead of reacting with instinct, that's when transformation becomes internalized. But what about discipline? Victoria pressed, what happens when students misbehave? When they disrupt class or disrespect authority? Those behaviors still have consequences, Sarah replied. But the consequences are natural rather than punitive. If a student disrupts the learning environment, they work with the class to repair the harm they've caused. If they disrespect someone, they engage in honest conversation about the impact of their actions. She pulled out another paper, this one handwritten in Marcus Thompson's careful script. Marcus wrote this apology letter to a substitute teacher he intimidated last year. Not because I required it, but because he realized the impact of his actions and wanted to make amends. Principal Hoffman read the letter aloud. Dear Mrs. Jackson, I know I scared you when you tried to teach our class last year. I wasn't angry at you. I was angry at everything, and I made you a target because you seemed safe to attack. I'm learning now that making other people afraid doesn't make me less afraid. I'm sorry for how I treated you, and I hope you're doing well in your new position. Sincerely, Marcus Thompson. The teacher's lounge fell silent. Even Victoria Hartwell seemed momentarily affected by the sincerity of the letter. This is all very touching, Victoria said finally. But what happens when these students leave your classroom? When they encounter teachers who expect traditional behavior, who don't have time for therapy sessions and feeling circles. Sarah's expression grew more serious. That's the real test, isn't it? Whether what they've learned about themselves, about relationships, about choosing their responses instead of defaulting to reactions, whether all of that transfers to other environments. And does it? Asked Robert Martinez. I think you'd have to ask their other teachers. Sarah replied diplomatically. Principal Hoffman cleared her throat. Actually, I can answer that. I've been getting reports from teachers across the school. Tyler Morrison has become a peer mediator in Mr. Garcia's history class, helping resolve conflicts instead of creating them. Ashley Rodriguez has been tutoring struggling students in Mrs. Peterson's math class during lunch breaks. Marcus Thompson stopped a potential fight in the hallway last week by simply standing between two angry students and asking them what they really needed. Victoria's skepticism was beginning to waver, but she wasn't ready to concede defeat. One semester of good behavior doesn't prove anything. These are teenagers. They're inconsistent by nature. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed again, and her consistent willingness to validate concerns, while holding her ground, was beginning to earn grudging respect even from Victoria. Which is why the most important thing I teach them isn't literature or writing skills. It's the ability to recognize when they're falling back into old patterns and to choose differently. She opened her folder one more time and pulled out a series of reflection papers. Every Friday, my students write honest assessments of their week. Not what they think I want to hear, but real reflections on their struggles, their growth, their setbacks. She read from Ashley's most recent reflection. This week, I caught myself starting to perform instead of being genuine when talking to a new student. I realized I was falling back into my old pattern of trying to control how people see me instead of just being myself. I stopped mid-sentence and started over with honesty. It felt scary, but also really good. Robert Martinez shook his head in amazement. I've never had a teenager voluntarily acknowledge a mistake, let alone analyze their own behavior patterns. Because they've never been taught that mistakes are information rather than failures, Sarah explained. When students learn that growth comes through honest self-reflection, they become partners in their own education instead of opponents. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and teachers began gathering their belongings. But the conversation had created a shift in the room's dynamic. Even Victoria Hartwell seemed thoughtful rather than dismissive. As Sarah collected her papers, Principal Hoffman approached her quietly. "Sarah, I need to ask you something directly. Are you planning to stay at Riverside High beyond your current assignment?" The question caught Sarah off guard. In the intensity of building something meaningful with her students, she had avoided thinking about the temporary nature of her position. I hadn't really thought beyond the current semester," she admitted. "Well, I'd like you to think about it," Margaret said firmly. "What you've accomplished in room 318 is remarkable, but more than that, it's replicable. I'd like to discuss the possibility of you training other teachers in your methods." Victoria Hartwell, who had been eavesdropping despite herself, turned back toward them. "You're talking about changing the entire school's approach to discipline and classroom management based on one teacher's experiment with one classroom?" "I'm talking about expanding an approach that's producing measurable results," Principal Hoffman replied. "Higher test scores, better attendance, decreased behavioral incidents, increased student engagement." "Victoria, those are the outcomes we all want, but at what cost?" Victoria asked, "What happens to academic rigor? What happens to preparing students for the real world?" Sarah looked between the two women, sensing that this conversation would determine not just her own future, but the future of everything she and her students had built together. "Victoria," she said quietly, "what if the real world needs more people who can think critically, communicate honestly, resolve conflicts peacefully, and work collaboratively? What if the skills my students are learning are exactly what the world needs most?" Victoria studied Sarah's face for a long moment, then glanced at the test scores still spread across the table, then looked back at the sincere expression of the quiet teacher who had somehow accomplished what 30 years of traditional methods had failed to achieve. "I suppose," she said slowly, "I'd like to observe your classroom, to see for myself what you're actually doing." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since entering the teacher's lounge, she looked completely relaxed. "Victoria, you're welcome. Anytime. In fact, my students have been asking if they could share what they've learned with other classes. Maybe you could help us figure out how to do that effectively." As the teachers filed out of the lounge, returning to their afternoon classes, the ripples of change that had started in room 318 continued to spread, reaching into conversations and consciousness throughout Riverside High. But Sarah Chun knew that the real test was yet to come. Because transformation, once it begins to spread, inevitably encounters resistance from those who have the most invested in maintaining the status quo. And not all of that resistance would be as thoughtful and well-intentioned as Victoria Hartwell's concerns. The biggest challenge to everything they had built was approaching, and it would require every ounce of courage, wisdom, and solidarity that room 318 had developed to survive it. The challenge came from an unexpected direction on a gray Monday morning in November. Dr. Richard Steinberg, Riverside High's district supervisor, arrived unannounced with a clipboard, a stern expression, and a reputation for shutting down what he called experimental nonsense in favor of proven traditional methods. Principal Hoffman met him at the front office, her greeting polite but tense. She had been expecting this visit ever since word of room 318's transformation had reached the district level. but she had hoped for more time to document and defend the changes. "Margaret," Dr. Steinberg said without preamble, "I've received some concerning reports about unconventional teaching methods in one of your English classrooms. I'm here to conduct a formal observation and assessment." "Of course," Margaret replied, though her heart sank. "Which classroom would you like to observe first?" "Room 318, Ms. Chun's class. I understand there have been significant deviations from standard curriculum delivery methods." As they walked through the hallways toward Sarah's classroom, Dr. Steinberg continued his critique. "I've heard reports of group therapy sessions, emotional manipulation, and a complete abandonment of traditional classroom structure. These students need to be prepared for standardized assessments, not coddled through feelings-based pseudo-education." Margaret Hoffman chose her words carefully. "Richard, I think you'll find that the academic results from Room 318 have been quite remarkable. Test scores, attendance, behavioral incidents, all the metrics we care about have improved dramatically. Temporary improvements mean nothing if they come at the cost of academic rigor," Dr. Steinberg replied dismissively. "These students need to learn discipline, structure, and respect for authority. They don't need some substitute teacher convincing them that their personal problems are more important than educational achievement." They arrived at room 318 just as the second period bell rang. Dr. Steinberg positioned himself at the back of the classroom with his clipboard ready, prepared to document evidence of the educational malpractice he was certain he would witness. But what he observed over the next 50 minutes challenged every assumption he had brought with him. Sarah Chun entered the classroom with her usual quiet confidence, greeting students individually as they took their seats. But instead of the chaotic free-for-all Dr. Steinberg had expected, he witnessed a remarkably organized and purposeful beginning to class. "Good morning," Sarah said, and the response from 28 students was immediate, genuine, and respectful. "Good morning, Ms. Chun." Tyler Morrison, whom Dr. Steinberg recognized from numerous disciplinary reports in previous years, raised his hand. "Ms. Chun, I finished reading the additional chapters you suggested from To Kill a Mockingbird, and I wanted to discuss Scout's character development with the class." Ashley Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. "I did too, and I found some really interesting parallels between Scout's journey and some of the themes we've been exploring in our personal writing." Dr. Steinberg blinked in surprise. These were the same students who had been described in previous reports as disruptive, disrespectful, and academically disengaged. Yet here they were, voluntarily requesting additional reading and initiating substantive literary discussions. Sarah smiled and moved to the whiteboard. "That's perfect timing, Tyler and Ashley. Today we're going to explore how Harper Lee uses character development to illuminate larger social themes. But first, let's check in with our writing partners about the narrative essays you've been working on." What followed was 15 minutes of peer review that was unlike anything Dr. Steinberg had ever observed in a high school classroom. Students paired off and shared deeply personal narrative essays with each other, offering constructive feedback that was both honest and supportive. Marcus Thompson read from his essay about learning to redefine strength, while his partner Jennifer Walsh listened with focused attention and offered thoughtful suggestions about structure and imagery. David Kim shared a humorous but insightful piece about the masks people wear in social situations, and his partner helped him identify moments where he could deepen the analysis. Dr. Steinberg found himself leaning forward, straining to hear the conversations. The level of engagement was extraordinary, but more than that, the quality of the writing and feedback was sophisticated, beyond what he would have expected from these students. When the peer review concluded, Sarah facilitated a class discussion about character development in literature that seamlessly wove together analysis of Harper Lee's techniques with insights from their own writing. Students made connections between Scout's coming-of-age journey and their own processes of growth and self-discovery. Ms. Chun, said a student named Rebecca, whom Dr. Steinberg didn't recognize from previous reports. I noticed that Lee shows Scout's growth not through what she says about herself, but through how her relationships change. Like, she starts seeing Boo Radley as a person instead of a monster, because she learns to look beyond her assumptions. Excellent observation, Rebecca, Sarah replied. Can anyone connect that to their own experience? How has changing your perspective on someone changed your relationship with them? Ashley Rodriguez raised her hand. I used to think Marcus was just trying to intimidate people because he was mean. But when I learned that he was actually trying to protect himself from being hurt, it completely changed how I saw him. Marcus nodded gratefully. And I used to think Ashley was just showing off when she spoke up in class. I didn't realize she was actually trying to contribute something valuable. My assumptions were keeping me from seeing who she really was. Dr. Steinberg scribbled notes frantically, trying to capture what he was witnessing. This wasn't the touchy-feely therapy session he had expected. This was sophisticated literary analysis combined with emotional intelligence and personal growth, and it was producing academic engagement at a level he rarely saw in advanced placement classes. The discussion continued with Tyler offering insights about how perspective shapes understanding, David analyzing the role of empathy in character development, and Jennifer connecting the themes to broader social justice issues. Each contribution was thoughtful, well-articulated, and clearly grounded in careful reading of the text. When Sarah assigned the day's work, a comparative analysis essay examining character development techniques in 2 different novels, Dr. Steinberg expected to see the familiar resistance and off-task behavior that characterized most high school classrooms. Instead, he watched students immediately begin brainstorming, collaborating on ideas, and diving into their work with genuine enthusiasm. Tyler, Dr. Steinberg heard Ashley say as she worked, you mentioned yesterday that you're thinking about the leadership theme in Lord of the Flies. Have you considered comparing Ralph's leadership style to Atticus Finch's approach in Mockingbird? That's brilliant, Tyler replied. They both try to do the right thing, but they face different kinds of challenges. Ralph has to deal with chaos and fear, while Atticus has to deal with ingrained prejudice. The conversation was happening entirely among students, with Sarah moving quietly around the room, offering individual support where needed. But the academic content was rigorous, the analysis was sophisticated, and the engagement was genuine. Dr. Steinberg found himself completely absorbed in observing the classroom dynamics. These students weren't just completing assignments. They were thinking critically, making connections, and pushing each other to deeper understanding. 20 minutes. Before the end of class, Sarah called for attention. I'd like to take a few minutes for our weekly reflection. As you know, we use this time to honestly assess our growth, our challenges, and our goals. She distributed index cards to each student. Please write about one way you've grown this week, one challenge you're still working on, and one way you've contributed to our learning community. Dr. Steinberg expected this to be the moment when the academic facade would drop and the emotional manipulation would begin. Instead, he watched students write thoughtfully, many of them pausing to consider their responses carefully. After a few minutes, Sarah invited anyone who wanted to share to do so voluntarily. The responses were remarkably mature and insightful. Jennifer Walsh raised her hand. I've grown this week by speaking up more in class discussions. My challenge is still trusting that my ideas are worth sharing. And I contributed by really listening to Tyler's essay yesterday and helping him think through his argument structure. David Kim followed. I've grown by taking my writing more seriously instead of always going for the easy laugh. My challenge is balancing humor with depth. And I contributed by helping Rebecca brainstorm ideas for her narrative essay. One by one, students shared honest self-assessments that demonstrated remarkable self-awareness and commitment to growth. Dr. Steinberg found himself writing detailed notes about each contribution, fascinated by the level of introspection these teenagers were demonstrating. Tyler Morrison was the last to share. I've grown this week by asking for help instead of pretending I understand everything. My challenge is remembering that making mistakes is part of learning, not a sign of failure. And I contributed by trying to be the kind of leader who lifts people up instead of putting them down. The bell rang, but students didn't rush for the door. Instead, they gathered their materials thoughtfully, said goodbye to each other, and several approached Sarah's desk to continue conversations about their work. As the classroom emptied, Dr. Steinberg remained seated, staring at his clipboard full of notes that contradicted every assumption he had brought with him. Principal Hoffman approached cautiously, uncertain of his reaction. Well? She asked quietly. Dr. Steinberg set down his pen and looked up at her with an expression of complete bewilderment. Margaret, I've been observing classrooms for 25 years. I've never seen anything like what just happened in this room. Sarah Chun, who had been organizing papers at her desk, looked up nervously. She had noticed the observer early in the class and recognized the formal nature of his visit. Dr. Steinberg, Principal Hoffman said, I'd like you to meet Sarah Chun. Sarah, this is Dr. Steinberg from the district office. Sarah approached with her characteristic quiet confidence, extending her hand. Dr. Steinberg, it's a pleasure to meet you. I hope you found the class informative. Dr. Steinberg studied her face, trying to reconcile the unassuming woman before him with the extraordinary teaching he had just witnessed. Ms. Chun, I came here today prepared to shut down what I assumed was an experimental program that was compromising academic standards. Sarah's expression remained calm, though her hands clasped slightly tighter behind her back. Instead, Dr. Steinberg continued, I observed the most academically rigorous, emotionally intelligent, and genuinely engaged classroom I've encountered in my entire career. He flipped through his notes, shaking his head in amazement. The level of literary analysis, the quality of peer feedback, the depth of self-reflection. These students are performing at a level that would be impressive in a graduate seminar, let alone a high school English class. Sarah smiled gently. They're remarkable young people. They always were. They just needed someone to see it and create space for it to emerge. But how? Dr. Steinberg asked, his professional skepticism warring with the evidence he had just witnessed. How did you transform students who were described as behavioral problems into scholars and critical thinkers? Sarah moved to her desk and picked up her grandmother's worn journal. Dr. Steinberg, may I ask you something? In your 25 years of observing classrooms, how often have you seen students who were genuinely excited about learning? The question caught him off guard. Genuinely excited? Rarely. Most students tolerate education at best. And how often have you seen teachers who were genuinely excited about teaching? Dr. Steinberg considered this more carefully. More often than excited students, but honestly, not as often as I would like. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. What if the problem isn't with students or teachers individually, but with a system that treats learning as something that happens to students, rather than something they actively participate in creating? She opened her grandmother's journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. My grandmother wrote, when students feel truly seen, genuinely valued, and authentically challenged, they will exceed every expectation you thought you had for them. Dr. Steinberg looked around the classroom, taking in the tree drawing that had grown into a full forest of collaborative art, the agreement list that students had created and committed to, the collection of stones on Sarah's desk that represented individual growth journeys. Miss Chun, what you've accomplished here is remarkable. But I need to understand, is this replicable? Can other teachers learn to do what you're doing? Sarah's smile widened. Dr. Steinberg, 3 weeks ago Victoria Hartwell asked to observe my classroom. She was initially skeptical about what she called touchy-feely teaching methods. Yesterday, She asked if I would help her redesign her curriculum to include emotional intelligence and collaborative learning strategies. Principal Hoffman stepped forward. Richard, Sarah has been working with our counseling staff to develop a school-wide program based on the principles she's implemented in room 318. We're calling it the Whole Student Initiative. And the results so far? Dr. Steinberg asked. Behavioral incidents are down 30% school-wide, Margaret replied. Attendance is up. Academic performance is improving across multiple classrooms. And teacher satisfaction has increased significantly. Dr. Steinberg turned back to Sarah. Miss Chun, I understand you're currently on a temporary assignment. What are your long-term plans? Sarah looked around the classroom that had become so much more than a place of employment. It had become a laboratory for transformation, a sanctuary for growth, a launching pad for young people discovering their potential. Dr. Steinberg. When I first came to Riverside High, I thought I was here to teach English literature. But I've learned that what students need most isn't just academic knowledge. They need to understand their own capacity for growth, their ability to choose, their responses to challenges, their power to create positive change in their communities. She moved to the window, looking out at students walking through the hallway with a sense of purpose and connection that hadn't existed a few months earlier. If there's an opportunity to stay and help expand this approach, to work with other teachers and students to create more spaces where young people can discover who they're capable of becoming. Yes, I'm very interested in that future. Dr. Steinberg made a note on his clipboard, but this time it wasn't a criticism or concern. It was a reminder to himself to recommend Sarah Chun for immediate permanent placement and to begin developing district-wide training based on her methods. Miss Chun, he said formally, I came here today to evaluate a potential problem. Instead, I've discovered a potential solution to problems we've been struggling with for years. He paused, looking directly at her with newfound respect. Would you be willing to present your approach to our district curriculum committee? We have schools throughout the region that could benefit from what you've developed here. Sarah felt a flutter of the old nervousness, the instinct to shrink back from attention and visibility. But then she thought of Tyler Morrison finding his voice as a leader, of Ashley Rodriguez learning to value herself, of Marcus Thompson discovering that his strength could protect rather than intimidate, of Jennifer Walsh gaining confidence to share her insights. Dr. Steinberg, she said, her quiet voice carrying new authority, I would be honored to share what these students have taught me about the power of seeing potential instead of problems. As Dr. Steinberg and Principal Hoffman left to continue their discussion in the administrative offices, Sarah remained in room 318, surrounded by the evidence of transformation, not just in test scores or behavioral reports, but in the fundamental way a group of young people had learned to see themselves and each other. Tyler Morrison appeared in the doorway, having returned from his next class. Ms. Chun, he said, I heard there was a district supervisor observing today. Is everything okay? Sarah smiled, remembering the terrified young woman who had first entered this classroom, convinced she would be broken by the students who now concerned themselves with her well-being. Everything is more than okay, Tyler. In fact, I think everything is just beginning. Tyler grinned and held up a folded piece of paper. Good, because Blake Peterson asked me to give you this. He said he's ready to stop fighting and start learning. Sarah unfolded the note, written in careful handwriting. Ms. Chun, I've been watching what's happening in room 318 for weeks. I'm tired of being angry all the time. Would it be okay if I transferred into your class? I promise to really try this time. Blake Peterson. As Sarah read the note, she thought about ripples in a pond, about small changes that grow into large transformations, about quiet voices that can reshape entire communities when they're finally heard. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that every student carries something precious inside them that can never be taken away. only revealed when they feel safe enough to let it shine. And she thought about the future, not just for herself, but for all the students who would benefit from classrooms where they could learn not just subjects, but themselves, where they could discover not just information, but transformation, where they could experience not just education, but empowerment. Room 318 had started as the graveyard of teaching careers. It had become the birthplace of a revolution, quiet, profound, and unstoppable. A revolution led not by the loud and the aggressive, but by the patient and the persistent. By those who understood that the greatest strength sometimes whispers rather than shouts. Sarah Chien picked up her pen and began writing a response to Blake Peterson, welcoming him into a space where transformation was always possible, where second chances were freely given, and where every story could have a beautiful next chapter. The quiet teacher had found her voice, and it was changing everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.